All right, we're recording. Go ahead.
All right, welcome to today's episode of Contributor Experience. This is technically the people-only meeting, as we're dubbing it. What that means is that only if there's time allowed at the end, we'll talk about automation and workflow topics. They definitely tend to control the conversation, so we try to have off weeks for things like contributor guide and mentoring and everything, again, that involves the people element to what we do here. So first on the agenda, as always, is our reoccurring meeting topics, and this is just to make sure that we have some things straight for the week. First, George, you are okay with a community meeting this week? I did tell Solly that I swapped out our community meeting hosting for Thursday, and he's cool with it. So just FYI that it's Solly Ross hosting the community meeting this week and not me.
Yep, I've already talked to him. He's all set. We've got everything
Awesome.
and the demo's all set and everything.
Awesome. And then also I do see some new faces on the line, and I wanted to reach out and say that if you're comfortable, feel like introducing yourself. If not, no worries. But just want to take a minute now to see if anybody wants to introduce themselves to the group.
Yeah, I'll go. My name is John Harris. I'm a solutions architect for Docker. Kind of been long time lurking a few other SIGs for a while, and looking to get involved in contributing, and this seemed like a good place to start.
Yes, lurk away, my friend, lurk away. All of our agenda, like I said, all of our agenda items are in the notes. The way that we communicate process changes is via GitHub issues to our mailing list, as well as copying SIG lead distros, as well as KDev distros. KDev meaning Kubernetes development at Google Groups. So you should see our things come out of there. I can also, after the call, share some other materials with you to see if you have any interest in jumping in with some of the things that we need help with. Cool.
Cool. Thank you.
Oh, sure. All right. Anybody else want to do last minute for intro?
Depends whether you can hear me.
Yes, definitely.
Oh, hi, it's Thomas, also
Hi,
from Google. And I was curious because this appeared suddenly at my calendar as a convenient time. I'm in Zurich time zone, and I'm working for Google Cloud Support. And I raised an issue internally at Google asking for, hey, we want better documentation, especially READMEs. And I was told I should get started joining this meeting and raising my concerns here.
Yes, definitely. Yes, this is the more public forum for that, and others can both weigh in and help us execute on the tasks that you need us to do so. So welcome, and I will go ahead and actually put you on our agenda right now. And so after we run through a few more things, then we'll get to your point, okay?
Thanks.
Yeah, sure. So hold on one moment there. All right. All right. So as old, shoot, what was I saying? George, do you want to ask for office hours volunteers?
Yeah, actually, I was going to do this during the community call, but office hours is next week, and we're always looking for developer volunteers. And I will share the URL in the chat. And sorry about the construction.
Yep. And on that same note, George takes care of the user office hours. I do the contributor, quote, office hours. We're calling that Meet Our Contributors. Both of us always need more contributors to help out with both of those events. If you would like any other information about that, please reach out to us. It's a very quick and easy way to reach two different types of audiences for contributors, community members, users and contributors. Cool. And then I know Elsie's on the line for graph of the week, so we'll talk offline about getting a graph for this week, so that we can run through the rest of the topics.
I think that also in our meeting last week, we had picked out, somebody had said that they had a graph for this particular week, so I think we're set actually.
Awesome. That's what I'm talking about. Okay. All right, and then let's just jump right into our agenda at this point. So I need to link on the doc right now. I'm going to do that right now through my email, but we did propose SIG leadership and composition changes. This was due to the steering committee having passed down the charter template for us. And inside of the charter template is the new composition and structure. Basically, this means that LC&I's current title, which is SIG lead, will be changed to chair. So each one of us will be co-chairing this project, and that just means running it from an operational perspective, helping to patch together our vision, goals and objectives for the quarters, etc. And then Garrett Rodriguez, who also is a SIG lead, we would like to nominate him as a technical lead. Garrett, for the most part, on his contributor experience journey, has been working on things like automation and workflow improvements. So we think that this is a better fit for him from both a skill set perspective as well as a leadership perspective in making those kinds of technical decisions for us. We also wanted to nominate Christoph Blecker. Christoph, I don't know if you're on the phone. Let me look. Yes, he is. We would like to nominate Christoph Blecker. He has been so amazingly supportive to the entire project, especially contributor experience. In the issue is not necessarily issue, actually, it was in the mailing list email. There is a huge list of his qualifications that he typed up himself recently to become a maintainer of the project, which ultimately did get approved. So we do need to weigh in on his nomination as well. And then I'm not going to go into all the sub-project leads while we talk right here, but the charter does really start to break down sub-project areas, and this all ties back to owner's files of the repo and how we ultimately have, quote, code ownership, if you will. I say that in quotes just because the community repo is mostly docs. Yes, there is definitely some testing infra and things like that in there, and that's something that ideally Christoph and Garrett would be leading from a contributor experience perspective. But to check, just please check out the email. We would love explicit +1s. If you don't have one, that's fine. But if you do have any objections and you would rather not raise it via mailing list or GitHub issue and would rather something a little bit more anonymous, please feel free to reach out to me personally, either on Slack or email, and we can take care of those concerns. Let's see. Any questions, concerns, comments about leadership and or SIG changes or why we're doing this or what the heck are you talking about? I've never heard this before. All right. I got a +1 from George. Last call. +1 to Christoph from Gwen. That's awesome. All right, so what we're doing as a final call, we are time boxing this in till this Friday. It works out to be 5 p.m. close of business Pacific time, which is midnight UTC. Last call will be at that point, and then we'll go ahead and move forward with changing things like the SIG YAML, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so the next thing on our list as we steamroll through here is the contributor site cap, and we do have Joe on the line as well. Joe is being awesome with us as we go through our very first KEP process. And for folks on the line who are new, KEP is the Kubernetes enhancement proposal process, very similar to Rust-Lang and Python and some other projects that we're kind of tailoring this to be our own. This has not been fully implemented in the project yet, but we just are taking this in stride and seeing how it works for us. But Joe has been wonderful with helping us through this process. And Joe, did you want to add anything about KEPs or about this process in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think view the KEPs as a tool for a SIG to use in terms of how to organize and sort of drive decision making. That's kind of the way that we're looking at it. As we get them published, that'll sort of put more and more weight behind that tool. I think these things become especially useful as you start trying to coordinate things across SIGs, where where it's not like, hey, everybody's friendly here, we know each other. You can make decisions pretty quickly within a SIG, but sometimes when you're trying to work cross SIG, having a little bit more structure and stuff written down can help there. And then the other thing, and just backing up a little bit on the whole SIG charter, from the steering committee's point of view, that is a template. That's a place to start. I think it's up to SIGs to figure out their own way to actually make things work. So I think it's totally reasonable for a SIG to customize that, come up with their own processes, their own ways to do stuff. I think that the big idea out of that is that there's a few ways that we sort of interface SIGs with the rest of the organization, and that's where things like chairs and the tech lead roles come in. Is it's a way to sort of it's an interface between the SIG and the rest of the project. So don't feel restricted by the template, please.
No, I think it actually works out really well for us, especially with what we're trying to do and achieve and things like that. So far so good.
Yeah. So on the KEP stuff, though, I mean, on KEP 5 specifically around the community side, I'm kind of a little bit of a holding pattern, just waiting to some of it's coming from you, Paris, in terms of where you want to go with this stuff. I'm happy to start prototyping. I'm happy to make an update to the KEP. Just give me a little bit of a direction on sort of where you think things should go, and I'm happy to follow your lead there.
Yeah. So I think we definitely need. I know it sounds weird saying that we need to stop calling it community site, but we really should start calling it contributor site, because there is a community site. And I think I am going to put in an issue separately from this to make the community site better, or figure out what's going to happen with that once we do go live with the contributor site. Because the one currently is not rendering right on mobile. And I say one, meaning the kubernetes.io/community site. So we really do, we really should care about the forward-facing deal there. But I'm ready to proceed. I don't think anyone has come to me with major objections. I think our next step really would be to socialize this for final comments. And then Joe, have you get started on a prototype, and then I guess we all regroup again for comments based on that and just keep iterating from there. What are your thoughts there?
So that sounds great. I'll rework the KEP, the PR that I have in flight. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I'll rework that. I'll make sure that we're consistent talking about contributor site to eliminate some of the confusion there. I think there was some pros and cons that I didn't summarize correctly. I'll make sure that those things are accurate also. Separately, does it make sense to, and I think this may be a bigger change, but does it make sense to rename Kubernetes/community, the GitHub repo, to Kubernetes/contributors or contributing, right? Because I think my idea here is that a lot of the stuff that's currently in the community repo would show up on this site. Not everything. I mean, I'm sure there's stuff that's missing, et cetera, but I think part of the confusion around contributor versus community comes from the naming of that particular repo.
Yeah, no, and that's fair. There is a folder on there right now called contributors, and what we could do is just organize the repo a little bit better, and then ultimately put things into either that folder. Does anybody else have any comments on that?
Yeah, I feel like renaming that would be like a long discussion that would happen on dev, but I think that you could do the stuff in the contributing folder and maybe generate a page per SIG, like their readmes or whatever, so they have a space, and then that would get us like 90%.
Yeah, I think right now, I mean, like, I don't think we have a good definition inside of that repo around, what is community and what's contributors and stuff like that. And I think, and part of one of the things I'd want to do a part of the contributing side is also have like a page per SIG where SIGs can actually put stuff, and that gets published there. So if a SIG wants to put something up on a site that gets indexed, we actually have a way for them to do that. Yeah. And all that stuff right now is at the root level. So I think it would be disruptive to move that stuff around too much. And I think it's not unreasonable to say, hey, look, Contribex owns, by and large that repo, right? Because I think one of the things we're trying to do is create an equivalence between repos and SIGs. And I think sort of the root of that repo is relatively like unowned, sort of a little bit of a you know, tragedy of the commons type of thing. So it might be worthwhile to try and really solidify ownership of that repo under Contrib-X and make that clear, and maybe actually make the naming reflect it. So just something I want to throw out there.
Yep.
Separable issue altogether.
I agreed, and we did call out ownership and a lot of ownership in the charter that we've checked in.
Okay.
So I don't know. And Joe, correct me. I know I'm jumping ahead here, but do we need to get steering committee approval on the charters that have been checked in?
Oh crap! I'm trying to remember where we landed on that.
I sent it anyway and never heard anything.
Yeah, I'll take a note on that and I'll follow up. I think we have a meeting this afternoon.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think it'd be neat as SIG starts to land their charter, they just like post it on dev so that like people are aware of what our progress is across SIGs.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay.
Well, I think so. Some of that, I mean, so you know, and again, I think over time we'll get better at sort of communicating this because we're still figuring this out. But I think one of the things that we want SIGs to do is to actually have a reasonable, fair process for doing things like choosing chairs, right? So that's like a requirement to be part of Kubernetes. You have to do that, and that's actually specified in the charter. And you know, and so if you're doing the template, then you know, then that checkbox, boom, you're done. If you know, but if you said, hey, we want to do, you know, pick chairs based on rotating every week based on, you know, this list of people with alphabetical last names. It's like, okay, I think that's fair. Maybe some change like that, we might want to have some wider review and approval around. So I don't know, I'll take that up and I'll make sure that I talk about that at the steering committee today.
Okay. And then to get back onto the contributor site, KEP, I am making notes in our agenda that Joe, you're going to make some more edits to the proposal, and then we're going to socialize it to both the contributor experience mailing list, KDev mailing list, and maybe SIG lead mailing list for a final call for comments before prototype. And then Joe, you'll take it away with the prototype.
Yeah.
Does that sound good to you?
Yeah, and that sounds good. And
Okay.
I think, you know, I think, you know, there's the status on the KEP, and I think right now it's in, I don't know what name we chose for the status thing, but it's essentially provisional is right now is the name, not draft, because people didn't like draft. So it's provisional. The next step there is implementable. So I think like at some point when we think, hey, this looks reasonable, we can take it to implementable.
Okay.
If we do some of the original work and we decide that, hey, this isn't working, you know, then we'll change, right?
Okay,
So
cool.
yeah.
All right.
Just one extra thing, Paris. Can you summarize and put that actually in the pull request itself? Because I don't want to get us in the habit of posting links to YouTube videos of our discussions.
Yeah.
That way people could just see the steps as opposed to.
Yeah, that's fine.
Because it wasn't obvious. It's still not obvious to me what the next step is on a KEP when someone does something.
Yep, I'll make all of
figure
these
that out.
edits.
Yeah.
I'll make all of these edits today too. I'll just pretty much copy and paste what I'm typing into the contributor experience notes. Anybody have any questions, concerns, comments about the contributor site? All right. I'll take silence as okays. All right. Actually, Tim says repo rename is a bit harsh, but mulling it, kind of liking the idea of line EK contributing name to a contributor site and the contributor experience SIG charter. Yes. Yep. I think we're all on the same page there.
Obviously, that would be a big change.
Yeah.
That's not something we do lightly.
Yeah. I mean, they're all, and they're
also
also
in front of everybody, right?
Yeah, there also is a repo called Contrib too. So we would probably want to watch out, I guess, on naming conventions there.
What's in the Contrib repo? Because generally in open source, Contrib means here's some crap that somebody gave me, no promises.
Yeah, and I think
that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, that's exactly. No, it's like that's exactly what it is.
So I think we may want to take that up and move that out to like, you know, some sort of like, you know, oh God, we had an archive type of organization or something like that for things.
Yeah, and I didn't even realize that that was a thing until DevStats came along, and then I was like, "Oh, contributor experience. How do we have data?" And then I was like, "No, that's not us. That's not us."
That's not it.
Yeah. All right. All right. So we're going to go ahead and move on. Tim, unless you had any more comments about that. All right. And then next on the agenda is Thomas. And Thomas, if you could do me a favor, because the folks here were not on the initial email that I remember reading about your concerns. So if you could just start with your concerns, and then ultimately we'll strike a conversation.
Okay. Yes. So I'm working as a technical solutions engineer in support, responsible for GKE, and one of my tasks is to review launches to make sure that our first level support has all the documentations they need to properly provide support for GKE. And normally for other products, because our team supports all of Google Cloud Platform, we ask the engineering team for every launch and for every major upgrade, hey, please provide us architecture docs, give us an insight, what are the components, where do they run? And traditionally, those would be Borg shops running on Google infrastructure, and we have a good understanding how they work, where to find the code, how to navigate it. With Kubernetes, everything is different. And also the velocity of Kubernetes is much higher than with every internal Google project that I've seen so far that we support, because there are thousands of people contributing to Kubernetes. So we need something better, and we need more support from GKE engineers. Problem is GKE, so the Googlers working on Kubernetes, they are only a fraction of all the Kubernetes engineers. So if I now go during a launch review to the Googlers and ask them, hey, we need more docs about this feature that is in the new Kubernetes version, then they tell me, oh, this was developed by Red Hat. We don't know about it. But I and my team, we should support it. So we need better docs and better architecture docs. So we don't need better docs for users. We need docs for people that need to debug stuff when it breaks or when it does surprising stuff. And my idea is, what I learned is, documentation people agree that the best place for this kind of docs is directly nearby the code in the same repository, and that it should be updated with every commit. You should also think, oh, does this affect actually the architecture? Should I also update the architecture docs? And my question is, how can we now get this started that developers see it as part of their job? Hey, when I do something in Kubernetes, there is a README nearby the code that also needs updating to document what is this component doing? What is it talking to? What are the known consumers of this component? Where's the entry point? What's the execution flow? What are the major data structures, and where in the code do I find them? And what is the roadmap? Is this a thing that is going away next month, or is this here to stay? So maybe feedback on this intro.
This is my wheels turning right now, Faith. Does anybody have any initial comments? I'm sure Tim Pepper probably does, but his mic's dead.
The one thing that I would ask is, is there any particular trends? Like, do you see, is it like a particular feature set you're not seeing the right docs, or are you seeing this basically across the project, where from your perspective in trying to like consume and understand the underlying architecture, where you are just not seeing the documentation you need?
So I had a support case last week about stateful sets, where pods in a stateful set wouldn't get deleted, and it turned out it was actually, I think it was a bug. In any case, engineers found something that they didn't expect. But what I noticed while I worked on the support case, hey, I have no idea what the current implementation of stateful sets is, how it is supposed to work internally, and then it's up. There are some strange collection of the pods while the stateful set controller is doing its thing. And where is this documented? And we support 3 different versions of Kubernetes at every given point in time, and all the point versions, the minor point versions. So I also need to be able to go and check out a branch of the code and check, okay, how was this supposed to work in Kubernetes 1.7? And Kubernetes is moving so fast. Like a year ago, or a bit over a year ago, when I started specializing on GKE, I had the impression, okay, I can still comprehend what is moving, what is going on, and what are the major blocks of Kubernetes. And now I observe it's not possible anymore, even for somebody specialized in GKE, to keep up with all the development. We already split our team in 8 people for different parts of Kubernetes. And even then, it's hard to keep up with all the development just in your area of responsibility. What are the developments? What is the current state? So yesterday, a vendor asked me, hey, what is this containerd process? And I was struggling, hey, do we still have Dockerd running on nodes? And do we use the container runtime interface actually in GKE? So many of these questions are, of course, GKE specific, and those should be handled in our docs, and that is our problem. But when it's about how does stateful set work, this is nothing that is GKE specific, and this should be properly documented in the controller for the stateful set.
So I just have a couple high-level comments. So I know at a point in time, like a point in history, a lot of the design proposals and architectural documents were moved out of the core repo, and that had to do with the velocity that the core repo and the code moves at, and how many contributions and how many changes there are. The keeping the architectural diagrams close was misleading, as it was difficult to keep them up to date with every flag of the implementation. So those docs that were like architectural design documents were actually moved out in favor of generating API reference docs. And that kind of stuff. And the API reference docs that we have are usually the most up to date because they're auto-generated from the source code. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, as far as if there's like a specific part of the project where you're seeing deficient documentation, the documentation is ultimately distributed out to the SIGs. So if it's like, something to do with kubeproxy or IPVS, that would be SIG network, versus something like stateful sets would be SIG apps, or the containerd process, whether we're using CRI or Docker, how that would present on the nodes, that would be SIG node. So the documentation is distributed out to the groups that are ultimately responsible for those parts of the code base. If it's something that is overreaching, where you're seeing like large parts of the documentation that are just out of date and that need to be tied up, or we need like some policy across the project. Ultimately, that would be SIG architecture, because they're the only SIG that kind of has that mandate to tell SIGs, hey, you need to do this for part of the code base. Contributor experience, like, you know, this is a great forum to talk about it, but ultimately we're not the decision makers as far as like what is a required component for the code for it to make it into the code base. We're doing like overreaching changes to what that code contribution process would look like.
Okay, thank you. So the auto-generated API docs are, of course, essential, and one cannot live without them. But they are, of course, not the same as a design or architecture doc, because they just give you the doc about the surface that's exposed, but not what is going on internally, and don't help you that much to understand the codes. And the move of the design or architecture docs out of the code base with the justification, hey, we cannot keep them current because the code is moving so much, that is something that I don't understand, because then this would be a problem, and moving the docs out is just hiding the problem but not solving it. So my take would be, we need those docs, and if we develop too fast, if the changes in the code are too fast to keep the docs up to date, then I'm sorry, but then the code changes must be slowed down, because without proper docs, the code loses value, and we have a problem in support land, and we also have a problem, and that's where we come back to this SIG. We have a problem for new contributors who want to understand what's going on and find the point in the code where to start doing their contributions, which is also one feedback that I got from a Google engineer internally, that, hey, we have the same problem with our new engineers to get them up to speed with the code base. So it's not only support.
Yeah, I think coming from someone who's looked at the code base with a view to trying to contribute recently, just the, not even necessarily the complexity, but just the sprawl and the fact that things live in so many different places and there's no clear pathway through the functionality and how components interact has been a really big blocker. I'd be interested to see if we have any like metrics on, you know, whether that's a big item that puts people off contributing or at least makes it really difficult. I think it makes sense that docs for those areas live in the individual SIGs, but ContribX is surely a massive stakeholder there, because like you say, Thomas, it's such a big barrier to potential entry for new contributors. And with also, the docs,
my team is a potential team of contributors, because I have seen code in the past where we could have easily increase usability, give better error messages, but contributing to Kubernetes as somebody who wants to do a commit every few weeks is a hurdle that I cannot come across.
I think this conversation should also happen in SIG architecture. Just from an overall project perspective. This is a large issue that I don't necessarily think we're going to solve today for sure. But we do need to ultimately, what we're talking about here is changing the culture of how developers are doing things and how they are documenting things. We did have somebody from SIG-ARC
what
on
my
earlier.
Initial internal concrete proposal was, I want for every owner's file that we have in the Kubernetes code, I want to also see a README. that describes, because an owner file for me indicates, okay, this is something that is one component where some people have distinct ownership for. And in that case, it's also a place to document, okay, what is this thing that people are owners of? And how does it work together with other things? And I wanted to ask first our Google engineers, hey, if there is a Googler in the owners file, I want to see a README, and I gave them a list of 4 or 5 questions. This is the things that I want to be answered by this README when I come there. And if we could solve this in the Kubernetes land and not internally from Google, and have starting with the best practice, hey, please go ahead and put a README nearby your owner's file, and this is how a good README would look like. I'm convinced that people will actually find ways on their own what is good stuff to put therein. Sometimes it's just that you don't have the idea that I'm supposed to write this and where should I put this. And once there is, it's easy to put the information there. Maybe things already improve. So I would start not with a guideline or demand, hey, you must write this, but with documented best practice, hey, this is how a good README look like. Please, if you are in an owner's file, take care of your README file, and then see how this develops, if this is already enough.
And Thomas, could you give us those 4 to 5, I think you said 4 to 5 questions that you were talking to Googlers about? Could you share those with us?
Give me a second.
Sure. And no rush necessarily now either, but it would be nice to see those.
Just to comment on that, I think that's actually, like, in my personal opinion, I think that that's a fair ask to have. If you're delineating a folder enough that there is a separate owner's file, to have some sort of description of what it is. I don't know that necessarily takes the form of what I would consider an architectural doc, but I think that might be a fair ask. What I would definitely say, though, is something like that, and having that be a requirement. Because to be perfectly honest, with the number of contributors that we have across the project, unless you have some sort of mandate around something where you have even like a recommended policy or a recommended best practice, it's not going to happen. I know there's lots of things that I've created that have READMEs. I know there's probably a few things that I've created that don't. But unless you have some sort of recommended or mandated best practice, it probably won't happen. The best forum for this discussion would definitely be SIG architecture, because that's the forum where these kind of like overreaching code design discussions, they actually have the mandate to say, okay, we're going to look to implement this change either by a recommended or a mandated best practice. That, for example, for the core repo, that this is something that we're going to look to implement or take on as a project to retrofit, and to organize with the code owning SIGs to retrofit. If we wanted READMEs in existing folders, what would be the best way to go and roll that out?
And I think Gwen had some questions and slash concerns. Gwen, do you want to say those out loud or no?
Sure. Yeah, as long as I don't open my mouth too much, let me know if I'm not speaking clearly. Yeah, so in general, I think this is a totally fair ask. And I also would like to say that we should bring this to SIG architecture, because a contributor or potential contributor came to us and said, hey, I'm experiencing problems. So I think Thomas came to the right people. And
thank you. Because this is already the 4th attempt that I'm doing with this. I tried it in private with engineers. I tried it with the whole group of Google engineers. Then I was sent to the documentation team, and they sent me here.
So I just don't want to give somebody the runaround, because I do feel like we should own this, at least in part. And I also think it's totally fair to, send people back to Thomas and say, hey, what are your specific concerns as well, right? We would like to lean on that. I personally think it's totally fair to mandate documentation. It's the way things are done in my org. Well, I mean, at least it's the ideal. And I'm usually the one that demands that people add some, because I'm usually the one that is new to something or the other and doesn't quite understand it. So that's kind of what my suggestion was. It would be really amazing if we could devise a program or some effort, maybe similar to the mentoring, the group mentoring that Paris has designed, where a potential new contributor can be maybe paired up with a code owner, sort of almost like as a mentoring, or basically like a mentoring thing, but some of the results should be readable documentation, because it's really hard to write documents if you don't know what's going on. And it's also really hard to write documents if you're in the thick of it and you don't even know what's hard anymore.
I think that's where I was going with changing the culture. I mean, demanding documentation and just using the D word in general in open source is culture change and overarching changes. So that's why I feel like this is a long-term problem that we're about to head into. We can probably do some short-term fixes. And Thomas, if you have areas of the project, I think, and that's what kind of Christoph was alluding to too, if there's areas of the project where you're like, this is absolutely barren and or zero, please let us know, and then we can at least take small steps into, making the larger problem better. But if we're going to SIG architecture and asking them to weigh in on these things, we are looking for, a longer solution here. Comments, questions? So I think actions, Christoph, or me, tell me if you want me, but Christoph, would you like to take this to SIG architecture? You can also give it to me, or Garrett. We can actually,
yeah,
even though he's not here.
Yeah, let's sync up after. I'd really like to see Thomas, if you're able to send out some of the those questions, that information to the Contribex email list, and we could kind of continue the discussion there, and how best to kind of bring that torch forward to SIG architecture and say, hey, this is what we're thinking. What would SIG architecture, how would you weigh in on this?
I've put the questions, I copied them to the agenda doc.
Okay, good. All right.
Fantastic.
Great.
So we have 2 action items here, right? Directly addressing the issues and coming up with temporary or at least emergency fixes. I don't want to say emergency. I don't know. I don't want to over dramatize things, but so anyway, helping Thomas out for now, but also being aware that we need to evoke a culture shift here.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious to see if other cloud providers and other people are having this issue too, and what their thoughts are. I know we heard from John, and John was sort of a +1 as well. I guess I'm just curious as to why we haven't heard this sooner. I mean, don't know, and I mean that as your comments are legitimate, but this sounds like a very large problem.
Yeah, has Contribex ever run a study on current contributors or potential contributors? Have you contributed? Do you get common issue blockers to contributing?
The only comment that I've seen, the last survey that we ran, we had roughly 140 contributors take it, and we have about 600 members in the organization. I mean, we have thousands of contributors based off of actions on GitHub, like comments and things like that, but members to the organization are the ones that we consider the most active. So, I mean, we saw a good amount of those in the survey, and the survey, the only like things that came up were architectural diagrams and just code-based layouts. But nothing to this, this detail, if you will, and nothing that necessarily called out documentation, so to speak.
I have a suspicion of why that is.
Yeah.
So I'm fairly new to the org, and I was lucky enough that when I started learning about Kubernetes, I was in a small office with tons of helpful people who'd been doing it for a while. So I was basically immersed in help was sitting right next to me and I think as the project picks up in use and more people adopt it, lots of people are coming there, they're bringing their entire office. Okay, we're going to learn about Kubernetes, but they don't have a specialist on site like I did. I was the only one who didn't know among 20 people. And so I could learn very quickly and very easily and always just ask somebody. And I think as the project is being adopted by more people, there just isn't that immediate connection. And so we have to rely more on written documentation and making things more clear because there isn't really somebody to immediately run to for help. And I know we are focusing very heavily on, hey, ask in Slack if you're confused. We really, really want your questions. Bring them to Stack Overflow, and those are all important. And I really I think those are handled very well. But at the same time, it would be awesome if we could head off people asking the same question 5 times in Kubernetes Novice.
That's a really interesting point. It'd be interesting to see how the feedback correlated to those who were in organizations with a long history of contribution versus more IC independent. I mean, I know certainly in Seattle, actually, a couple of friends and I are thinking of starting up like an in-person working group just to look at the code, go through, write our own annotations, fork it, and put our own type README stuff in and just try and understand it. Because I think that kind of community area and kind of focused area works really well for that. But yeah, I don't know. That's a really interesting point though.
John, it sounds like you're volunteering yourself to help us with this.
Sure. I mean, honestly, as someone who understands, from an application point of view fairly well, and obviously working at Docker, we work with this stuff all the time, but I'm not on the engineering side, but I have a strong interest in that and have done some Go. I've contributed to Docker and would like to contribute to Kubernetes, but the code base is fairly daunting, I'm afraid to admit.
Yep. And that's why I think we tell new contributors to just try to either A, jump in and take an issue, or B, lurk. And it sounds like you've been doing the lurking bit quite a lot. So
yes.
Congrats on that. Matt, I think, did you take yourself off mute? No, I guess not.
I wanted to add just one recent experience. So since I had this issue with READMEs, I asked more engineers when they came to me with, hey, we made this, and do you need anything from us? I asked them to find the right place in the Kubernetes code base to document it directly there, instead of asking me whom to inform and where to put it in our internal docs. And I have the impression that they actually were relieved. Oh, it's that easy. I just put it in README there, and then people can find it. So I have hopes about this.
Well, we have hopes too. All right, so let's get to actions then. We will take the points that you put into the notes, and I know Elsie's also been taking some notes for us on this. So we'll take those to architecture, and Christoph and I will talk offline about who and when we'll do that, and then we'll go ahead and send out a note to the mailing list and go through our normal communication process to get this circulated. Cool.
Thank you.
Yes.
And
All
thanks
right.
very much, Thomas, for coming and sharing your concerns. Like with
Yes.
this, we definitely want to welcome more feedback of that type of like, hey, I'm not rooted in the Kubernetes tradition right now. What we're already doing. What kind of what could we do better? What can we do differently?
Exactly. And I want to plug, and another thing, actually, I want to go back to the really quick, and then I want to end this so that we can go to other things. One of the survey things that I noticed as a trend was that people did say lack of documentation, but they didn't necessarily go into where, how, or who. If you ask people, tell me what you think about Kubernetes documentation, generally across the board, you'll either hear, one-word responses. And then if it's on the negative side, no one really necessarily goes into too much detail. So this, Thomas, thank you very much for bringing us this detail. This is exactly what we need to kind of push that needle forward and make changes, is when people are very descriptive about what exactly it is that the documentation's missing. So appreciate that. All right, now that was the last item on our official agenda, but we do have a few minutes left to wrap, so we can either get those back, or does anybody have any concerns, questions, comments, or another agenda item that they would like to add quickly? All right, next week is our automation and workflow and people meeting, so we will talk more about things like the cherry pick process, and some other items that we have on the future items list. And if no more comments, then I bid you adieu. Thomas and John, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate new contributors on the line.
Thanks. I'll be back.
Yes, please come back. All right, thank you.
And
Bye,
I'm
everybody.
adding more stuff to the agenda doc.
Yes.
Look at it.
I will.
Ciao.
Thank you so much, Thomas.